Good evening, everyone. I think it's evening now. And we are going to start this session on the path to climate resilience, a SIDS, Small Island Developing States, and Caribbean perspective. My name is Jean Leon from the Development Bank of Resilient Prosperity. And I'd like to welcome all of you who are here, as well as my esteemed panelists for this evening session. We have a very wide group here that covers the multilateral space in the European Investment Bank and the CARICOM Development Fund. We have country representation in the Development Finance Corporation of Belize and the Development Bank of Maldives. But we also have, I want to say, non-sovereign, non-country specific. We also have a regional private sector facilitating element in the initiative CAP business covering the countries in the Indian Ocean. And equally, we have I want to say non-traditional, meaning non-economic, proper, a legal representative that will, I think, be a very great complement to the sets of issues we face, and focusing on the ocean side, and that's from the TANIA, from the International Platform for Ocean Sustainability. So as you could see, we have a good round-off. What I propose is to set the stage by giving us a quick synopsis of where small island developing states and the Caribbean, in a sense, fit this located space that we are in. And then I will have and invite each of the panelists to make their presentations, and if I can equally add, maybe they can use 20 seconds of their allotted 8 minutes just to give a little introduction about their particular institution, beyond just the name, so we can all locate this appropriately. We'll do 8 minutes presentation for each, and at the end of that 8 minutes, then we will have room for questions from the floor, as well as follow-up perspectives from the presentations themselves. So that's the order of business. We look to finish by about maybe 7:15, because we are starting just a little late. And so that's the plan for this afternoon. So in terms of setting the context, big picture is that small island developing states in general have not achieved the potential growth that we believe they ought to have achieved. I think that's the bottom line that we are faced with. And the question really is, how do we transform that particular state from underachieving potential to even overachieving potential? And to be able to do that, I think we need to just step back a little and ask potentially what are the specific factors that may have limited that potential. And I think there are generally two strands of factors that we tend to talk about. The first is what is fairly well known is the small island states have peculiar structural characteristics, we normally say vulnerabilities, that have limited their potential for growth. And whether it is small size of endowments in terms of population, in terms of resources, or remoteness in terms of distance from centers of poles of influence, or whether it is a lack of diversification of those economies, those are seen as factors that have limited the potential of those countries. And so we tend to say this as factors that are defining characteristics of those countries. They're not things we change or can change overnight. Then there are the shocks that typically occur, and shocks can emanate in an economic space like our global financial crisis or the pandemic COVID or the oil crisis that we've had. But in each of those cases, they originate from the outside. And when they impact those countries with amplifying effects because of those structural vulnerabilities, structural factors that they have. And the impact then becomes even more entrenched. And then there's a third dimension to that, is shocks that are not man-made economically, and I say man-made in inverted commas. You have natural elements or natural shocks that hit you, and that is more in the area of climate, whether it is from hurricanes to cyclones to earthquakes, even eruptions, tsunamis that arise from those, that impact those countries. And when they impact them, then there's a destructive line that occurs. And here we need to now see a very important element, which is after those events occur, those structural factors that we talked about before, the vulnerabilities, they now transform into resilience issues, because you now need to say how quickly can you rebound. And the duration of that recovery is a function of capacity, it's a function of access to finance, it's a function of your initial conditions. So that now defines another element of vulnerability that is almost dynamic, feedback vulnerability that makes the life in countries worse. But there's an equally pernicious aspect to that, which is when those shocks occur and you layer it on the structural elements that you have, then your ability to rebound is less. It means that your risk profile elevates. And when your risk profile increases, then the very issues you had at the beginning of cost of borrowing gets amplified. And it gets amplified means that your debt situation gets even worse than you had before your vulnerable state actually occurred. And so when people talk about small island developing states, they conflate all of those into one big line and say those states have unique characteristics. They are in need of special circumstances, and they need to have tailor-made, customized solutions for what it is that they need to do. And so it is coming out of all of this that we ask the question, how do we get out of this very complex situation? Which institutions will be able to help us? What policies do we need to be able to undertake? What sources of finance will actually help drive this? And so these are the types of questions we want to get out of today's discussion. And as I said, we are going to try to get this from a multiplicity of perspectives: economic, financial, environmental, legal, that all contribute to the totality of the solution that we face. So there's complexity in the diagnosis, and by extension, complexity in the solution, but there has to be equally simplicity in the execution. And so while we are breaking this down into pieces, at the end, I think we want to see this as a complex but coherent, coordinated attack on the bigger questions that we have. So that's the stage setter that we want to be able to do. And I want to start my panelists with Barbara Makito of the European Investment Bank. If anything, because she is bringing this wider institutional perspective and can talk about the total experience of EIB's interaction over the decades with small island developing states by way of experience, by way of lessons, to put a little more color to the overview that I've just given. So, Barbara?
Thank you very much, Jean, and good evening, everyone. I am here on behalf of the European Investment Bank. We are the bank of the EU. Our shareholders are the 27 member states of the European Union. The bank was founded in 1958 under the Treaty of Rome, so a long history, and the EIB is one of the largest multilateral lender and borrower in the world. And we're active not only in Europe, although that's where the bulk of our investments takes place, but also globally in Africa, in our neighborhood, in Latin America, and Caribbean, the Pacific. So we really have a global outreach. This analysis that I'm going to present was carried out jointly with ALIDE, that was gracious enough to carry out a survey of public development banks for us. It's not easy to get these data, so we're particularly thankful to ALIDE for helping us with this. I have a presentation. I will try to maybe go through the slides quickly and spend a bit more time on the ones that are more meaningful to today's discussion. And while the analysis centers around Latin America and the Caribbean, I mean, the Caribbean islands are small developing or emerging economies, so I think some of the results and the findings are relevant and can resonate more broadly. Just to a quick scene setter on climate risks, we have developed at the EIB in the economics department climate risk scores according to two dimensions: physical and transition risks. In this in the bar chart, you see the physical risks, and the red part of the bar is the damages stemming from acute events. Storms, fires, hurricanes, etc. And you can see that in countries like the Caribbean, for instance, this is explaining really the largest part of the risks. And also you see that the bars for Caribbean, also Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa and the Pacific, of course, are higher, 2.5, 3 times higher than the rest of the world. So these are really countries that are disproportionately affected by climate change, although they contribute very little to CO2 emissions. It's less than 5% for Latin America and the Caribbean, but if you zoom in on the Caribbean, I think it's less than 0.4% of global emissions. So they contribute very little, they suffer a lot. And I think this is, again, something which applies generally to small island states. I will perhaps skip this slide on the investment needs, but numbers, estimates by the from the Economic Commission from Latin America and the Caribbean and the IMF range between 2% and 5% of the regional GDP, meaning 290 $1 million per year. So demands are huge, and all the actors, the public development banks, the multilateral development banks, the countries and the private sector have to play a part. The stake of a challenge is just too big for individual actors to succeed alone. Now, going to our survey, we carried out this survey to try and understand what is the role that PDBs are playing, what is the role that they can play, what are the challenges that they are facing. We included, we managed to get answers from 28 PDBs in Latin America and the Caribbean, covering, spanning across 15 countries and accounting for some 50% of the assets of PDBs in the region. So quite a representative sample. And the first question we asked them is, what's their exposure to climate risk? And again, given the high general exposure of the region, it's not surprising to hear that the banks in the region are feeling the burn themselves. 40% of them reported that extreme weather events have damaged their physical assets. And I think, importantly, about 60% of the banks in the sample say that extreme events have also contributed to deteriorate the quality of the assets in their portfolio, in their loan books. And among those impacted, banks report that the most affected category is typically the segment of micro and small and medium enterprises. The second thing we asked the banks in the survey is what is their approach, what is their strategy to climate change, and to what extent they see themselves as playing a role in it. The overwhelming majority of the banks in our sample told us that they believe that climate transition represents an opportunity more than a risk, but they don't see themselves as trendsetters. Luckily it's not too large a percentage, but 7% of the banks in the sample told us that they are skeptical about the need for a green transition, and they do not acknowledge climate change as a risk. On the other hand, more encouragingly, we have 46% of the banks that see themselves as followers. These are banks that are following the trends in the market, but more to keep up the pace with competition rather than as a result of a deliberate choice or a risk assessment. And then we have a good 30% of the banks in the sample that see themselves as promoters. These are the ones who are actually developing strategies and actively addressing the challenges emerging from climate change. And 20% of the banks see themselves as leaders, so fully embedding climate risks and in their framework and strategies. What is interesting to observe, and I think we should focus on the right-hand side of the chart, is that there seems to be a clear link between the type or the type of PDBs and their behavior. So, for instance, PDBs that see themselves as leaders are also those who are lending more in the green space. 22% of the loans in the leaders' portfolio is represented by green loans, whereas the banks following in the skeptical category do not offer any green products to their clients. So there is a link, and if you look at the flows, the bars to the left-hand side, in terms of flows, there is a positive trend. So I think this is an encouraging feature. We then asked about the obstacles. What is holding them back from doing more in the green space, in the space of green finance? And most of the constraints that the bank sees are on the demand side. So they are relating to lack of skills and tools from their clients, lack of awareness about the green transition, and also lack of awareness about the green finance opportunities. When we asked them about what is it on your own, the constraints that you see for yourself, again, lack of standardized metrics and also capacity and tools is identified as a main constraint. And again, there is a link between the type and the constraints that the banks are facing. So the less engaged PDBs, the more they are skeptical, the more they identify capacity as a constraint for them to engage. And I think this is pointing to one of my main conclusions, is that by raising awareness and by strengthening capacity, we can enhance the involvement and the engagement of PDBs in this space. So this is, I think, the first key takeaway from an analysis. Enabling an institutional setup. There has been a lot of talk in the previous panels as well about the need to define green taxonomies to create enabling environment for private investors to come in. And I think in this connection, IFIs and MDBs like the EIB and many others around the table and around FIX have a crucial role to play, not only in providing patient capital, but also in building capacity. I think the panel before this spoke a lot about greening the financial sector and what MDBs are doing to build capacity. And I would stop here. I hope I haven't taken too much time, and obviously happy to take questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I think that's a really good segue into what we are about to hear next, because what we are saying is, in aggregate, we have a risk appetite issue, and whether it's on the demand side or on the supply side, we are not yet having the ability to actually deliver. And so what I'd like to get is a slightly different perspective from the Caribbean itself. And I'd like to invite Dr. Laverne McFarlane of the CARICOM Development Fund to give us their perspective of not only the structural issues, the perspective of solutions, and see whether we have a commonality or even a link with what the EIB ALIDE survey is providing. Laverne?
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Really a pleasure to be on this panel. A genius idea from my colleague Henry, and happy to be on this panel. So the CARICOM Development Fund, we are a treaty-based institution similar to the EIB, but certainly not as elaborate as the EIB. We actually started operations in 2008, and we are basically funded by our member governments, the governments of the Caribbean community. Caribbean community pretty much is embedded within a single market and economy framework. So within that context, our primary mandate is to provide technical and financial assistance to the disadvantaged groupings, because as we seek integration within the Caribbean community, we recognize that disadvantage come about in various ways, whether it's by vulnerability because of the mere existential risks of hurricanes, just general climate change, the mere vulnerability or disadvantage as a result of integration happening, but it creates that level of disproportion among the population that exists. So within this context, we pretty much have certain thematic priority areas, and we recognize that because the Caribbean community, the islands themselves, Belize included, though not an island, but it has a significant amount of coastline. We recognize that vulnerability and therefore disadvantage is brought to the Caribbean community just by the mere existence, just by climate change actually taking place. Within that frame, we have sought to improve upon our interventions to our member states within the context of them being disadvantaged. What we've actually done is started in terms of the various financial innovation that we're creating different financing tools so that we can crowd in the private sector, crowd in various forms of financing that are out there in the space. We're also looking to crowd in the regional domestic resources that exist as well, because we recognize that the intent really is to create that level of de-risking that is necessary to attract the private sector and the various resources. There are two products that I wanted to highlight that is pretty much addressing these issues. One is the credit risk abatement facility, and this really is a credit enhancement tool that we're using as first partial risk guarantee. And what we're doing is pretty much incentivizing the private financial institutions, commercial banks, the credit unions, and any institution that pretty much lend to the small and medium-sized enterprises within the renewable energy and energy efficiency space. The idea really is for this facility to be an ecosystem that addresses not just creating that credit enhancement, but also to provide the technical assistance to the various stakeholders within the ecosystem. Recognizing, of course, that because we are in a new paradigm where not everybody understands the technology, understand the jargon, or what really should be happening in the renewable energy and energy efficiency space, we provide technical assistance to all the players within that ecosystem, players including the small and medium-sized enterprises. For example, we give them technical assistance to conduct the energy audit, help them to understand how to interpret the various basically how to interpret an energy audit and what it means for their bottom line. We provide technical assistance to the financial institution as well, recognizing, of course, that typically financial institutions, they do understand how to underwrite other loans for your mortgages, for your car loans, and so forth. But coming to understand the technology on renewable energy and energy efficiency is a new thing for these financial institutions. So we provide the technical assistance to them. So that's it on the credit enhancement front. So what we're doing there really is providing up to 80% in partial risk guarantee as a first brush. So that's one layer of insurance that we're providing. The second instrument that I'd like to highlight is the Caribbean Community Resilience Fund, CCRF as it's termed. Now, this facility pretty much is meant to be a blended financing fund that is intended to crowd in the private sector. The idea really is for it to target climate resilience and economic sustainability within a context where we recognize that there is a role to play for the private sector, indicating that not the public sector, while we recognize that there are products and projects that will be uncommercial and the private sector will not have any interest there, there are in fact projects that will be commercial enough to attract the private sector investments. So we've been able to create a layer of insurance by providing first loss capital within that fund. And in so doing, we were able to 9x the amount of capital that we're bringing to that fund. So we're catalyzing the investors. We're crowding in the private sector, the philanthropies, the foundations, as well as the multilateral institutions within that frame. Interestingly, what we've done is leverage the private sector by outsourcing the funding, the management of the fund. So we've created a hybrid public-private partnership in that frame because we recognize that there is a risk to unfamiliarity. So for the CARICOM Development Fund itself to go to the actual private investors that we want to crowd in, that's really unfamiliar territory for them. And so it would be difficult. There might be a risk priced in if we ought to attract those private investors. So we outsourced the management of the fund to a known private fund manager within the Caribbean region they're quite familiar with the Caribbean market and are able to raise the funds and has the requisite pipeline that is needed for when the proceeds come in. So we are ready for use of proceeds where that is concerned. So those two are the critical elements in terms of what we're doing in terms of building resilience, ensuring that there is economic sustainability. And we're just now in the process of structuring a new facility related to sustainability, greening the financing space, and also ensuring that there's resilience in the climate financing sector. So I'll pause here for now and elaborate a little bit more if there's opportunity to do so in the next round. Thanks.
Thank you, Laverne. I think we've heard in particular the non-leaders are the ones that prefer to not engage in climate space, from Barbara, but also MSMEs were the ones that had the greatest impact. And so, Laverne, your intervention that in the specialized needs element in the CARICOM community area, you've looked to try to help MSMEs get around this high risk aversion or high risk assessment element of this through the risk mitigation or de-risking element through your two facilities, the credit risk abatement and the community resilience fund. And I think those are important elements that enter into which projects that can actually be financed at what affordable cost to at least help advance. But we would still need to, and I hope we will get from a couple of other panelists, how do we zero in on the fit for purpose investments? Because that's the reverse side of the cost. The cost itself is a function of the risk. The risk we can reduce through your risk abatement financing aspect, but now the choice of product and the capacity, which is now the other side of risk, is something that we need to equally address as we put strategies and policies together. So with that, I want to get a third perspective, and I am going to zero in on Henry, the Development Finance Corporation of Belize, to give us not only a country perspective, but a regional perspective on how all of this is coming together. Henry?
Thank you very much, Gene. And it's a pleasure being here. The Development Finance Institution is Belize's National Development Finance Institution. It was started back in 1962. And that's when Belize got self-government. So the Right Honorable George Price, when he was pushing for independence, the moment there was self-government, he realized that to develop Belize, you needed a development finance institution. So that's really cool. What I will do today is to share maybe a more granular perspective. So we work with clients, and we work, let's see, with what Laverne is doing, and we try to deliver services. And we work with EIB in the past, we have worked with the IDB, the Caribbean Development Bank. But there are certain issues we face. So I will tease that out. But before I get there, so I'm going to touch on four things. The context from where we sit, suggest a coordinated regional response, look at the role of the PDBs or the DFIs in the Caribbean, and then make a quick call to action. Barbara mentioned the vulnerability of the region, so I won't go over that anymore. Essentially, when we look at it from our perspective, it's an existential threat, sooner rather than later. And what this study also showed was that the economies that maybe not maybe, that generates more of the emissions are the ones that are least vulnerable to the effects and more adaptable. Whereas in the Caribbean, we are more vulnerable and least adaptable. So that's a double whammy. Now, when we look at what's coming in terms of climate change, all the physical risks that have been mentioned, but there's a fundamental platform that breeds inequity in our minds. And it's basically the point that we are receiving damage and we're expected to borrow our way out of that damage. That can't work. If I drive my car into your fence, my insurance have to pay, or I have to pay you for the fence. So there is something off. And while that's the case, we have to figure out how best to live in the context of that, because that's the case. Right? Ultimately, for the Caribbean and SIDS, given the histories of our economies, and I think Jean kind of touched on this at the beginning, our vulnerability to climate change is exacerbated by the structural issues we have because of our histories. Right? And no, it's not only climate, but it's nature as well. So when you get into the blue space, we're seeing changes there that we have to look at. So let's look at some of what the region, and I'm talking the Caribbean here, we need to have a sense of urgency. When you look at finance in common, the Caribbean is largely absent. Right? All of the important dialogue that is happening, we're not here, we're not advocating, we're not learning, we're not creating the networks. And that's why, Laverne and I coordinated, and you guys are great to join us in this. So we need a sense of urgency. This is like you're watching the movie, and the bomb is going to go off, and it's 10, 9, 8, and you're trying to figure out which the red thing or the blue one, which wire you're going to cut. We need to transform our economies as development will provide the road to resilience. The climate financing with the additionally helps, but it doesn't go down deep enough. And if we want to ensure that we can, pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and be able to take care of ourselves to some extent, we need development. Right? Another thing that we need to look at is what the IMF calls public financial management. And this is something we don't talk a lot about, but it basically speaks to how a country should manage its resources to create fiscal space and how you use that fiscal space and ensure that you send transparent and accountable signals to the market. When you look at the countries, we have bits and pieces in place to bring it together, but we have not gotten there, and I think that will change a whole lot. In our view, again, looking from the perspective of a DFI on the ground, the world is at a conjecture point. I mean, we're watching the news, ODA going to defense. I'm not sure if it's G20 anymore. It's 1 plus 19, 20 minus 1, but there are changes. We can't change that, but we have to figure out how to survive. But there's a big opportunity, and it was being discussed in the panel before this, or, well, not in here, but where I was, the AI revolution, right? And there's an opportunity for us to be on that bandwagon. Maybe not as developers, but certainly as users, right? Whoever made the guitar wasn't the best guitar player. And we have brilliant people in the Caribbean. So we need to wake up and realize we need to move in that direction. And there are low-hanging fruits, Jean, that in the other section I will talk about, but we need to be more agile, more proactive, and we need to design simple and effective solutions. A lot of academic solutions or studies, and I used to be the provost of a university, so I'm fine with that. But when you're dealing with climate change, we don't know what's going to happen. And you're dealing with people's lives. So we don't have 4 years to wait and do a study and come back again. Right? In terms of the DFIs, what we need to do, we need to realize that we have to get ready. We have to modernize our governance framework to be able to receive the resources that are there and execute. In the Caribbean, and Belize less so, I'm proud to say, we talk a lot and we have a lot of initiative, but we lack what I call finitiative, the ability to execute the projects. And at the DFC right now, we're going through a digital transformation process that's using no code and AI, and it ties into our monitoring, evaluation, and learning system. I will talk about that some more if we have some time later. But while we're small, they say it's easier to turn a canoe than an aircraft carrier. Well, we're a canoe that's turning. And in the Caribbean, that sort of transformation is required, because if we are unable to deliver, then the price goes up. The complexity of the monitoring and evaluation that we have to do. When you look at accessing, let's say, the green climate funds, it comes with, I call it, ornate bureaucracy, devoid of timelines, right? And when everybody speaks about the risk of putting in the funds and knowing exactly where it's going, again, the inequity steps in, because we are the victims in a way, and I'm not crying victim, but we are not in the world paying attention to where the problem is coming from with the same veracity that is put on us. And we were talking yesterday, and Gene said something, and I agree with him, that it may be better to be 70% successful in executing a project than trying to spend a lot of time and putting a whole lot of bureaucracy to be 90%, and we are wasting resources that could have gone to the problem. So those are the things that we see. I can give examples as we go on. We must also ensure that we evolve into the national mechanism for development of the country, and that is what Belize is doing with the DFC. So in this first part, I want to throw out some points here, because I may not have a chance to do it. But CARICOM needs an urgent mandate to say, you know what, we will work to strengthen our DFIs so that they can be ready to drive our developments. And why? When we get you go to GCF accreditation, you modernize your framework so you're transparent, you're accountable. All right? In the case of the DFC board, although we're government owned, it's private sector led. So when you have to look at possibility for corruption or things like that, it is not there. We actually changed the law to say you can go to jail in the case of the DFC. So we are above board. We need to come together and to create an association of Caribbean development finance institutions and learn from each other. ALIDA has been trying to work with us from about 2016. DFC, Caribbean Development Bank, a couple of us are members of ALIDA, but there's a whole lot more that could be done, right? I sit on the board of ALIDA, and so I'm advocating for that, but that is something we must do. The Caribbean and SIDS must lend their voice at Seville. The beauty with the Caribbean, it's 32 of us, right? When I used to work in healthcare, it's my second career, in PAHO, once Central America and the Caribbean agrees to something, we never mess with the budget, right? It happens. We just, stuck in our lane. And so we have the ability to drive and assist FIX in getting things done. We must also encourage FIX at this summit, in the final communique, to capture that DFIs in vulnerable countries like the Caribbean and SIDS countries need specific support to become the engine of change for their economies, right? That's on the macro level where, as it's stated in the communique, but we also need to go further, where they need support to be able to unlock the liquidity that they have locally. In Belize, small number, but big for us, we have $750 million in liquidity. But we lack the tools to be able to unlock it. Now, the CDF is doing some of that at a macro scale, but there's things that we can do right there if, we get the support and maybe some of the participation to build the guarantee funds that are required to be able to do stuff. One of the other things that we always talk about with my team, if you look at AML CFT, that's across the financial sector. Belize just got ranked, I think, in the top 15 in the world. We did a lot of work, so we're beautiful there. But what if in the Caribbean we were to say that across the financial sector, you must have an environmental management system, so that all the investments have to be climate smart and look at the social factors, because that builds resilience at the end of the day. So those are things that I think we need to look at as a region, right? The damage and loss fund, I don't know how far that is coming, but a category 5 hurricane stuff, right? Puts you back 10, 15, 20 years just in a few hours. So in a nutshell, that's where we are, and those are what I think. In the go-around, I can give you some more examples, Gene.
Thank you, Henry. I want to quickly make a couple of points, because Henry has added another dimension too, not just the experience and the couple of tools that have been brought on. There's now need for urgency in building voice. That's an important point that was made. Second, that we need to have instruments that can unlock the liquidity at various levels, not the macro alone, equally down. And very importantly, he's introduced the role of national development banks as a medium through which that unlocking can occur. And that's not traditional. We tend to think of the MDBs and the IFIs and the government, but now there's another layer, and I think it's a point coming out of the system today at FIX, that there's a key role for PDBs, the entire system of PDBs to play to now help advance the development space, and I think that's a very good stepping point that we need to note. With that, I want to introduce our next speaker from the Maldives, Gregor, and just to equally note that we are a little tight on time, so let's try to stick as much as we can to our 8 minutes so that I give everyone an opportunity to make their interventions. Yeah?
Thank you very much. So I'm going to take a slightly different route and talk very much about a practitioner's experience of setting up an institution that's supposed to tackle issues of investment in climate and climate resilience. My background is I've been doing this for the last 20 years, and I've been doing it in emerging and developed markets. I've assisted in the setup of the UK Green Investment Bank, the European Fund for Strategic Investment, which was run by the EIB, the European Commission's Innovation Fund, the Saudi National Infrastructure Fund, but also in some emerging markets like Southeast Asian Climate and Energy Facility, and most recently, Development Bank of Maldives. And that's a long history to talk about one important point, that SIDS are fundamentally different, and they're not just different in terms of their vulnerability, they're different in terms of the approach you need to make when setting up an institution. And I'm going to talk through some of those differences and some of the changes you need to make in your approach in setting up a development finance institution. And we at the earliest stage of the setup, just putting the institutional arrangements in place. First of all, you've got to recognize that not only the local industry and the local economy is more vulnerable to climate change from a physical point of view, but because of the structure of the economies. Most economies in island states are less diversified, and certain of the industries that are dominant are more vulnerable to climate change simply by the nature of the industry. Tourism, for example, in the Maldives, climate change has led to acidification of coral. That's a clear customer advantage in the offering of Maldives. It reduces the fish stock, another part of a huge part of the local economy. But when one looks at setting up an development financing institution, one has to say, what are the fundamental building blocks that you need in order to make it successful, and what are the obstacles and why are they different? So the first thing you've got to recognize is that in investing in certain of the assets that you need to make an economy move to more climate responsible or climate resilient infrastructure, the challenges are different. Some of them are geographical. So for example, if a government is announcing that by 2030 or 2050 that you need to reduce your fossil fuel usage by a large percentage, they're more important in an island economy because these foreign investors generally don't know the local environment very well. You've got to give them that sort of comfort, but you've got to give them a comfort that you can demonstrate you're doing it based on international best practices. So the local development bank, in order to invite the MDBs, the EIBs of the world, the European DFIs, has to be able to demonstrate that capability, and you have to structure yourself to look and feel like an institution that they're familiar with. The last thing that I wanted to talk about is the challenges that you have in building up an institution where you have, one, a lack of project readiness, and two, a lack of local resources in an investment institution. So we're at the very, very early stages of setting up a development bank. And of course, at the early stages, there are not many other resources that have development banking personnel or long-term infrastructure investment experience. So what you have to do then is be able to provide training, provide the right source of individuals who you'd bring into the country to be able to train up a staff base that can make those investments. And then secondly, you have to go out into the markets and make sure that projects are investment ready. So in some cases, there might be an announcement of a particular project or a procurement done, and it might be done through, let's say, the Ministry of Finance, but you know, for example, for a renewable energy installation, a grid study hasn't been done, environmental early stage feasibility hasn't been done. So in order to make sure that you have investable projects, you've also got to push yourself slightly earlier down the investment chain, whereas in a developed market, you're simply investing. An opportunity comes to you in a well-structured PPP, or an opportunity comes to you in a well-structured IPP type environment. Here you don't have that. In some cases, you've got to push yourself a little bit into that uncomfortable area where you're doing a little bit of the late-stage development, or you're imposing certain requirements on government departments for procurement, or the investors that are approaching you for investments. So I'm going to leave it there, but that's very much a practitioner's view of what the challenges are and how you try and overcome them from a small island developing state development bank or an early stage of developing the proposition for a development bank. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregor. I think you've reminded us of a very important point. This is not a keep it simple, stupid proposition. It is an exercise in complexity. And we need all the bits together to work if we are to make this a success. And you pointed out a number of things. We need policy certainty, the long-term vision that tells the investor they can actually invest. We need the ability to scale, because some things require a step move before they can become efficient. We need to have good investment propositions, not just the credit risk from the price side, but the appropriate investments to be able to make it work. And we need the capacity to deliver, capacity to prepare, to make this come together. And importantly, they all need to gel at the same time in a coherent way, else the building blocks for success are not there. So having said that, I think I want to move to the Indian Ocean, where Salima will tell us exactly how they did it. Not now what is needed, but how they did it. Salima?
Thank you, Dr. Jean, and thank you everyone for the invitation. So I just want to set the scene and explain to you what is the organization that I represent. First, what we are not. We are not a bank. What we are an organization that regroup the Chamber of Commerce of 6 islands: Mauritius, Madagascar, Seychelles, Comores, Mayotte, and Réunion Island. And like you said, we were in 2020, there was an external factor that impacted us, the COVID. And after that, we wanted to build a more resilient economy. And to do that, we have identified some priority areas where we will be where we wanted to work with the private sector. It was on blue economy, on biodiversity, circular economy, and gender and inclusion. Now the question is, how do we work with them? We needed funding. This is where the AFD came into picture. We secure a grant from AFD, Agence Française de Développement, where we design a roadmap from 2021 to 2026, how we are going to accompany them. And with that, we have designed an approach, a 3-pillar approach. We identified ourselves as a knowledge partner because we need data. Data is very important in order to ensure a just and resilient transition. We can't just come here and tell them to do something if this is not supported by information. So what we do is, the first thing is we identify ourselves as a knowledge partner. We partner with consultants, we partner with the academia, we partner with university in order to do a regional assessment on the thematics that we want to work with them. For example, we are currently doing a biodiversity impact assessment for the sector of activities of tourism and agriculture. How the tourism sector, how the agricultural sector is impacting the biodiversity, and what is the strategies that need to be put in place in order to mitigate this impact. Now, the second phase, the second pillar on our methodology is we position ourselves as a technical partner, because we need experts in order to accompany these private sector. So we have a pool of project managers that are experts in technical areas. We have project manager on blue ocean economy. We have an expert on biodiversity. So we are also doing the capacity building of the private sector in order to align themselves to the Paris Agreement, in order for them to understand what is the global biodiversity framework. And the third part, the third pillar, is we are positioning ourselves as a project partner. This is where the financing came into picture also. We had the conversation with AFD because we do have the financing to finance a sustainable project for the private sector. But we realized with the limited amount of fund, we want also the private sector to put in the money. So what we did is a co-financing mechanism where with the funding of AFD, we are not really sponsoring, but we are providing like 60% of the fund, and we are asking the private sector to put in the 40%. Now, this is very important because when the private sector put in the money, they also put in their commitment towards that project. And one project that we are currently working is on carbon strategies. What we are doing is we are accompanying private sector in their analysis of their carbon footprint, and also doing the capacity building of their employees on how to calculate the carbon footprints. And the third part is how to adapt or mitigate with regards to the results that they are getting. And we asked them, we also did, what we did is like, we are going to accompany you for the first year. The second year, you're going to accompany yourself. So you need to we're already having this conversation with them. How do we see the next phase of that project? And what is also very important to know that with this collaboration between a development fund like AFD and ourselves, our organization, is we do have the knowledge and we do have the context, what is really happening in the area. And we can also like advise, can we do a 60 and 40% on carbon, because we realize that in the economy, that the companies in the Indian Ocean region are very impacted. Their clients are the European countries, and with the Green Deals coming, they want to do that. So we can ask them 60%. But we are doing another project on providing grants on sustainable projects, and for that we are doing 85 and 15% co-funding. So with our expertise, with our knowledge, and with the interaction that we have with the private sector, we can play with the percentage, where we can also ensure that the profile of companies that are benefiting from the co-financing has different kind of profile, because we don't want just big organization to have this kind of support. We are also accompanying, doing the capacity building of small enterprise, of SMEs, on how to get access to this kind of fund. How do you report on the fund that you have received, and how we are going to evaluate you, and how you need to keep track of your expenses in order for you to get access to that funding and maybe the next fund that are going to come.
Thank you very much. I think that's a good example of what I call the new partnership between the public and private areas, I don't want to call them sectors, that contribute to national goals. And importantly, and it's an element I think we need to reflect on, the activity that takes place needs to be handheld. And so I think the point you make of how do you continue to interact with them as your partner pillar, not just the co-financing, but the technical support, the continuity you provide, the based upon knowledge, are critical elements to give that continuity going forward. And so when I say embrace complexity, it is because all of those things need to happen if you are to have success. And I think far too often we forget that. We stay in our zone and expect that things will happen organically. They don't. So with that, I think I want to open up that space a little more and to make the point that while we are focused on climate and while we talk about vulnerabilities from climate, climate itself is not divorced from the oceans, not divorced from the land, not divorced from the atmosphere that create the outcomes we call impact of climate. And those impacts are themselves system-wide. And so I think we need to see not only the oceans, therefore, as part of the solution to our climate problems, the financing of those need to be there, but equally important, the whole issue of rights, the issue of governance, who owns what, and therefore how can we influence that is an important element that should not be left out. And so with that, let me allow Tanya to give us a bit of legal insights.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. It's really an honor to be sharing the stage with all of you for this important conversation. And thank you, Jean, for the introduction. So briefly, my name is Tanya Brody-Rudolph. I'm an international ocean and environmental lawyer. I'm based in Cape Town, and I work from a systems perspective. So the idea of complexity is really interesting to me. I'm associated with the University of Stellenbosch Complex Transitions Lab. And I'm here today to speak in the capacity of the International Platform for Ocean Sustainability. It's a new initiative that's being launched. It's supported by the European Union. The feasibility study was being funded by the European Union. And the idea of the IPOS, we call it the IPOS, is to provide this capacity bridge between not only science to policy, but also knowledge to action. So often you hear about the science-policy interface, but we've broadened that conversation because science needs to include other types of knowledge, including private sector, including local communities, and it's not just policy, but actually how to implement the policy in a way that's an enabling environment and that actually has an impact. So I'm going to talk a bit about that, but just to start with, we've had a few people reference the challenges of the ocean, but I just want to highlight that the ocean is in a state of emergency. Apart from warming, we have increasingly choked oceans with pollution, declining fisheries, acidification that we've heard about from Gregor, which is impacting corals around the world. And we have stratification, which is where deoxygenation occurs, and you get these dead zones in the ocean where all of life disappears. So this really is a collective crisis, because no matter which country we're from or which institution we're from, we're all ocean citizens. We all belong to the ocean and we come from the ocean. So we have to think about this as a collective problem, but it has to be dealt with at a national scale, because that's where the policies are actually implemented. So we need to do both, the global thinking, because this challenge is global, but national responses. And I think the important thing to note here about SIDS is that they experience this existential threat of climate change and the impacts on the ocean in the most extreme way from a legal perspective, because what's happening with climate change is that baselines are shifting. So when you talk about a state and their national waters, you measure from the baseline, which is the technical definition. But with climate change, baselines are shifting. So this has a direct impact on a state's sovereignty. The state has sovereignty over its waters. It has a right to sustainably use its resources. But if baselines are shifting or creeping, that has an impact on state sovereignty and their rights. And it has an impact on local communities. Of course, we've heard about the vulnerability, the structural challenges, but what we haven't heard about so much today, and I want to take us there, is the local community's experience of this change. The people are experiencing these changes, not just economies. People that have a livelihood from fisheries. They have a cultural and spiritual connection with the ocean. And all of this is occurring with this disproportionate burden that Henry mentioned. There's this disproportionate burden on small island developing states that have the least to do with this climate change, but actually have the most urgent need to build resilient societies and economies. But we're here to discuss solutions, so I'm going to move out of the existential crisis mode and talk about what are the solutions that we need to finance, not only to ensure that these small island states have an existence, but also that they have viable economies. And there are some practical examples of global tools that are being floated at the moment, and one of them that's in conversation at the moment is the Sustainable Ocean Plan, which I'm sure you're all aware of. And there are multiple endeavors that are happening with sustainable ocean plans, including under the umbrella of the IOC Ocean Decade, the 100% Sustainable Alliance, which France and Chile are leading. There is the Ocean Agenda, the Ocean Action 2030, and I think some of the partners are here today, all talking about sustainable ocean plans. This is essentially an umbrella framework for a state to manage its crises, and also the outcome of that is that it can then comply with global commitments like the SDG 14 and the 2030s that we've heard about. But I think what's important when you talk about these tools, which we've heard a lot about the lack of tools, we have these ideas around how we can address this problem. Let's have sustainable ocean plans, great. But states can't do it because they don't have the financial capacities, or they don't know how to manage the flow, so they can get finance in, but they don't know how, there isn't sufficient clarity on where the funding should go. So there's this sort of project pipeline, but the impacts aren't actually really effective. And I really liked, I think Jean spoke about the 70% success rate. I think that's a really powerful thing to think about, is if we take too long and we get 90% perfect, we may just miss the boat, and the ocean may actually become unviable, which means the whole planet becomes unviable. So it's really important that we move into action and move into concrete action. So I have an example that I like to use from Belize. And it's I talk about legal innovations as part of a transition, because if we want to transition, we need innovation and financial innovation, of course, but legal innovation. Belize has a really interesting innovation, which is the Integrated Coastal Zone Management Plan that was promulgated in 2016. And what was different about this approach was that they brought a collaborative approach to informing the policy. So there was an integration of a bottom-up approach with local community stakeholders and a top-down approach from government and private sector getting involved. And the power of collaboration has been demonstrated by that. So it's not perfect, but it's had such an impact. For me, one of the things that I really took away from that experience was the removal of the Belize coral reef from the IUCN Red List, which occurred as a result of this policy. So that's a really tangible impact from a project, and that's what we need to be doing. We need to be achieving tangible projects. So I think what was also interesting with that project was it was followed up by a set of indicators, and we've heard about monitoring and evaluation and the challenges of that, and how much money needs to be spent on that. But there was this indicator that was developed to assess Belize's progress and other countries in the LAC region. Belize was very successful in assessing their risks, but they were less successful in obtaining sustainable finance. And we've heard about that problem, and I think Jean mentioned it yesterday in the Ocean Coalition or Ocean Summit, was this is not a sprint, this is a marathon. We need funding that lasts over time, because it takes time to implement these changes and these policies and to see the impact. So But I found that really interesting. And what the IPOS will do, the International Platform for Ocean Sustainability, is to bring this additional capacity to states. So it has a global network of scientific institutions that are in support of the IPOS, 35 of the base global institutions, scientific institutions around the world, to bring knowledge. So it's nice to hear about your project, Salim, and I'd like to hear more about it. But it's very much knowledge-driven, science-driven, and also collaborative-based, to bring private sector into the conversation, to bring local communities into the conversation, because it has to be anchored in the truth of what local communities are experiencing, and to develop policy solutions and pathways and options and scenarios that actually help a state implement a tool like a sustainable ocean plan or a marine spatial planning, or to know what the project pipeline should look like. So I think those are the key elements that I wanted to talk about, and happy to tell you a bit more if there's time about IPOS and how it works and what the services would be for states and a call to action about that. But I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions or anything else that needs to be said.
Thank you, Tanya. What we've heard now is a complementing or augmenting element to what we've been hearing. But it tells me one thing that I said at the beginning, but I'll repeat it again. This is not a problem that is handled with simplicity. We have to embrace complexity, even if we deliver with simplicity, but we have to embrace complexity. And what we have heard is, at least from 6 panelists, each a different perspective of addressing the problem. And therefore, and I believe each of you have contributed significantly in the perspective you've brought, but the solution is not one, but all. And so I think we are left with, in my mind, what I call the 4 C's that need to be in place. We clearly need capital. That's the first. And when I say capital, not just the instrument or innovative instruments, the deployment, the unlocking, the channeling, we need capital. Second, we need coherence. All the pieces need to be working together if we are to make progress. But we need consistency, because it is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And we need to be able to continue to improve and deliver it throughout. And we need the 4th C, capacity. Without the capacity to implement, to deliver, to understand, we will not get there. And the basis of all capacity is knowledge, which I think is where Tanya just ended. Without knowledge, and that means the science, we are not going to progress. And if we need knowledge that's based on science to actually get to finance, to deliver on social well-being, it cannot be an economic solution. It cannot be a physical solution. It can't be a government solution. It has to be multi-dimensional, multi-discipline, multi-stakeholder to be able to make this actually work. Hence why it is a complex solution. So I have almost, in a sense, summarized what I've heard, given time, but I think we still have a few minutes to operate. I want to see whether there are first any questions from the audience. Can I see any show of hands? And if not, which I am not, what I'd like to do by way of closing is, rather than have another summary, I would invite each of the panelists to tell me in a minute each what they heard, not from themselves, but now from another panelist, that either resonated or is a takeaway for them going forward. So let's start in reverse order. We'll start with Laverne, going to Henry, and then we'll go to Tanya and come up this way. So, Laverne?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so this was really a very rich discussion. I was very enthralled with everybody. What brought it to really resonated with me is the legal perspective, because I've never actually thought about climate within that realm. So thank you, Tanya, for bringing that perspective to us. But of course, every single one of the panelists, I took something away, EIB, in terms of the data being relevant and fit for purpose. Gregor mentioning how you go about developing the new institutions. I've pretty much been very much involved in that with the new fund development, so I can relate completely. You're in your new institutions and the actual practical element of it. And of course, from Henry, where he sits from the national perspective and bringing such rich discussion to it all. So really, it's the takeaway really is that, as Jean said, it's how do we collaborate, how do we bring together all these bits and pieces so that we can really find that solution. There's no one solution, there's no one size fit all, and it's about us really continuing the conversation so that we can get to the actual tangible results that we're seeking to achieve in all this. Thanks.
Thank you. You said one takeaway and you summarized for everyone, so it's left me. So I was focusing on one, and then you disturbed my mind with one of each. Unfortunately, I will take only one. So I will take what you, Jean, told in the beginning, because what you said set the scene, but also summarized what everybody said. And what I really like is the notion of having a complex situation or complex, let's say complex situation, but how can we find simplified solution in order to tackle this complex solution? So I think the word is how do we simplify things and how do we collaborate with each other in order to move forward.
I think this is getting increasingly difficult. What I'll say that stood out to me here and was basically the power of listening to the people who are impacted, right? And I think Tanya, you mentioned that. And when I look at what we're doing at the DFC, the only thing we haven't really spoken about here is technology, because our small little organizations need technology. And I'm going away from what I'm being asked, but I want to share, because we found a solution called Creatio, which is no code. It comes with AI embedded in the foundation, right? And every piece of data we put in, we can use. So in terms of automating our meals, we just put our data matrix in, and over time, the AI is learning. And it's something that we can afford. And because it's no code, we can adapt it to our workflow. All right, and a lot of times organizations like ours can't get the tools we need. So that's a powerful tool that is here. So I want to add that to the discussion because I didn't mention it before. But I think we touched everything here, and if we focus on the end user, on the person who is impacted, I think we can simplify things in a complex space to be able to deliver. I think the world still has too much complexity, and I used to be in health, and there's a saying that the surgery was successful, but the patient died. Yeah. And that's a clear and present danger.
Thank you, Henry. Let's go to Tanya.
Yes. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed the panel discussion as well, and I felt enriched by everyone's contribution. I think the takeaway for me, which you summarized just now, Jean, you're getting a lot of hits here, was this need for additional capacity, this need for tools. This has come up so many times, and also that the solutions are going to be states need solutions that are multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder engagement across the board, across sectors, across disciplines. And I really resonated with what Salima said about that local knowledge. You need to be grounded in local knowledge, and I think this is something that's really important for us at IPOS, is that we can help states in their context with their scientists and bring additional capacity if needed, but to be locally grounded in the knowledge, so that and locally grounded in the finance. actually. There's also something that was raised earlier, that domestic banks need to have some skin in the game. And I think that those aspects really are so true. That really resonates for me, that you have to bring the solutions to the context, and the context has to be able to continue and to be sustainable in order to be resilient. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Thank you so much to everyone for today.
Thank you, Tanya. Gregor?
Yeah, I think you posed that question very cleverly, in the sense that you were slightly giving us the answer while asking us the question. But the answer that I think I'm coming to is that I feel we've only really scratched the surface today. And everyone has said something that makes me want to ask them another question, or ask them a lot of questions, in fact, thinking like, you might have a solution to something I'm struggling with, which makes me think there is really a need for a community of practice and a shared grouping or a shared knowledge base amongst small island developing states, especially in the development banking world. And I'd want to propose that we create something like that. So we have a forum to share experiences, to ask. I mean, what came into my mind when I was thinking about how I was going to answer this question was, when my aunt was cooking, the first thing she'd do as she was, putting the spices in the pan, would phone up the other auntie and say, well, do I put 2 cardamom pods in, or do I put 3? And that's the sort of relationship we should have. We should be able to immediately be on the phone, be able to contact, and you can overcome a problem maybe in a day that might have taken you 6 months.
Barbara?
Perhaps I would like to close with something that nobody has said, but I think it was kind of undercurrent. We have been focusing on climate, but I think broadly, and for small island development states more generally, I think climate and other vulnerabilities, be it debt, be it gender, be it access to finance, because of the small size of the economy, are even more interlinked. So solutions should be tackling or looking at the problems you mentioned, the comprehensive, the consistency. I think it's really important, and in different ways, looking at the institutional, then we move to the urge. But I think it was an undercurrent in our discussion. And thanks again for, bringing so many different perspectives and nuances.
Thank you very much. I couldn't agree more. It's one of the mantras I talk about now. We live in systems. Things occur and impact system-wide. Therefore, we cannot solve a system-wide problem with a part of a system solution. You will never solve it, because the reverberation is always there. Now, that is not saying you solve everything at the same time. You cannot. But it says the map, the blueprint, the layout of the solution needs to take everything into account. And so when you tackle the solution, you effectively take a picture, which is the whole, break it up into a jigsaw puzzle, which is 1,000 little pieces, simplicity, and you deliver on a simple piece. But delivering on that piece is not ad hoc. It has a purpose. And the purpose is, when you finish the 1,000 little pieces, you have a picture that is coherent, a picture that is implemented consistently and will deliver on a complex issue, which is the outcome. And so that is where I want to leave you here. But I like the idea of a community of practice. I think that is necessary on any knowledge sharing, knowledge-based approach to development. And I would want to suggest, Henry, that maybe one of the things we can do coming out of this forum is to say, let's leverage the people around the table, the panelists, who are from, as I indicated, not just different regions, but different disciplines and approaches to the problem. Let's start with us, and have an initial community of practice. To start, there's nothing wrong in us doing that. It's within our power to do it. We don't have to wait for somebody else. And we can just keep that conversation going, starting today, and let it widen as we go forth with time. So with that, I want to thank everyone. I don't know, Henry, if you want to have a closing word.
We're making a new COP, community of practice.
So thank you, everyone, for coming, and for those of you who participated, the listening, and I hope this was insightful and helpful to you. Thank you.